The annual Flaxborough Women's Institute Produce Fair was, in principle, a modest celebration of domestic perseverance. Its chief attraction, however, lay not in the crocheted antimacassars or the oddly militant displays of marrow, but in the jam contest, a field of endeavour where reputations were cultivated as jealously as roses and defended with equal ferocity. This year the hall smelled richly of sugar, boiled fruit, and furniture polish, the three odours locked in a genteel struggle for dominance. The ladies of the Institute had lined their jars in perfect symmetry along trestle tables, their labels neat, their gingham covers pressed flat as though for military inspection. Beyond the jars, chairs creaked beneath matrons who had begun rehearsing their indignation in whispers, lest the judges prove insufficiently discerning. Mrs. Clegg, the reigning champion in plum conserve, had stationed herself near the entrance in order to intercept and, ideally, intimidate arrivals. Her rival, Mrs. Dewhurst, hovered by the sponge cakes but kept one eye firmly on the jam table, ready to swoop should anyone admire Mrs. Clegg's jars with dangerous enthusiasm. The rest of the town, gathered in genial curiosity, enjoyed the sport of watching the contestants pretend at civility. The judging committee, three solemn councillors with more experience of pork pies than plum jam, proceeded down the rows with furrowed brows. Councillor Dibb, whose palate was reliably swayed by anything approximating whisky, showed suspiciously keen interest in an orange marmalade whose fragrance suggested it might have been fortified against the frost. All seemed as usual until Councillor Harbottle, bending over the jars of black currant, went pale, muttered something inaudible, and beckoned his colleagues with a sharp jerk of his head. The murmuring in the hall, always a background accompaniment, faltered into silence. Mrs. Dewhurst pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Mrs. Clegg straightened, her bosom rising like a sail in a gust. The councillors conferred, glancing about with unease. Then Harbottle, clearing his throat with the solemnity of one announcing war, declared, "Ladies, gentlemen, I regret to say there has been a most irregular entry." Gasps rippled through the company. People craned their necks, jostling to see what jar might so scandalize civic honour. There, among the modest ranks of strawberry, raspberry, and gooseberry, sat a jar labelled in neat handwriting, "Special reserve for judges only." Its contents were not the ruby gleam of berries, but a cloudy suspension in which unmistakably floated a small, pale, waxy object. One needed only a glance to suspect it was not fruit at all. Mrs. Clegg fainted with gratifying promptness. The rector's wife screamed. The vicar, more practical, ushered small children behind the Victoria sponge display. Word spread out of the hall and into the high street before the councillors had even found the courage to place a cloth over the offending jar. By the time Inspector Purbright was summoned from his office, the town was already engaged in its favourite occupation, deciding with confident unanimity precisely what dreadful thing had been discovered in Mrs. Clegg's jam. The discovery of the peculiar jar did not take long to ripple outward from the hall and across Flaxborough, like a tremor through poorly set jelly. By the time Inspector Purbright had exchanged his hat for one that suggested official dignity rather than gardening practicality, the town had already furnished its own version of the affair. Each retelling improved upon the last, until it was possible to believe that the Women's Institute had staged not a production fair, but a séance gone wrong. Mrs. Poole, whose husband ran the hardware shop, reported that she had it on sound authority that a severed human ear had been found floating in black currant jelly. This had the pleasing effect of shocking her neighbour into silence, until the neighbour retaliated by countering that no, it was most definitely a finger, and not just any finger, but one belonging to the late Mr. Clegg, who, though still inconveniently alive, was well known for his short temper and thick hands. Before luncheon, a version involving an entire baby's toe was already circulating, passed on with relish by by the assistant librarian who had never forgiven the Women's Institute for late fees on a book about tatting. By contrast, the councillors who had made the discovery were reticent. Councillor Dibb was heard muttering repeatedly that it looked foreign, as if that absolved the town of blame. Councillor Harbottle avoided mention altogether, and whenever pressed, spoke vaguely of an irregularity before hurrying off in search of tea. Their reluctance to specify gave the rumours a healthy climate in which to ferment. Mrs. Clegg, who had been revived with smelling salts borrowed from the curate's wife, soon found herself in the curious position of both suspect and victim. She declared with force that she had never in her life tampered with preserves, save once when she had accidentally used salt instead of sugar, and that it was an outrage to suggest otherwise. "I have enemies," she confided loudly to a cluster of sympathetic ears near the cake table who would like nothing better than to see my reputation spoiled. The tone in which she said it implied that her enemies might be numerous and of violent disposition, though in reality they were more likely to be fellow churchgoers irritated by her habit of singing a bar ahead of the organist. Mrs. Dewhurst, listening from behind a display of chutney, smiled a smile that was almost tender. She confided to her own circle that she, for one, was not surprised. That woman has always had a heavy hand. I dare say she put her whole arm in this time. The remark was received with appreciative titters, though one or two listeners expressed a nervous curiosity about what had actually been in the jar. Inspector Purbright arrived at the hall some 20 minutes after the discovery. He did not hasten, he rarely did. Instead, he walked with the calm, almost weary step of a man aware that whatever awaited him inside was likely to be less terrible than what was already being said about it outside. The hall was still crowded, though the focus of attention had shifted from the jam table to Mrs. Clegg's fluttering protestations. The offending jar had been covered with a folded cloth of paisley design, which lent the mystery the appearance of an inept conjuring trick. Purbright, after a courteous greeting to the councillors and a quiet word to Sergeant Love, approached the table. The cloth was lifted, revealing once again the jar with its cloudy suspension and its pale, waxy fragment. It was not immediately identifiable. It had the shapeless look of something too small to be dramatic, yet too peculiar to be innocent. Purbright bent forward slightly, hands clasped behind his back, and regarded it with the polite concentration of a man asked to admire a neighbour's collection of spoons. Then he nodded as though confirming the jar's existence to himself, and let the cloth be replaced. "What do you make of it, sir?" Sergeant Love whispered, wide-eyed. His imagination, less disciplined than his superiors, was already busy. "Looks a bit like, well, I shouldn't like to say." "No," Purbright agreed softly. "Best not to." For the moment he asked no further questions. Instead, he strolled about the hall, exchanging brief pleasantries with townsfolk. He remarked upon the size of Mrs. Fenwick's onions, expressed interest in the embroidery of a tablecloth, and paused to compliment a Victoria sponge. To those who knew him, this apparent inattention was familiar. Purbright had a habit of letting people talk themselves into greater honesty when they believed he was only half listening. By the end of his circuit, he had collected, in the form of casual remarks and anxious whispers, a dozen distinct versions of the truth, each contradicting the other, but together forming a useful map of suspicion. Meanwhile, the gossip outside had reached the high street in earnest. Shoppers leaned across counters to exchange tidings with shopkeepers, who in turn passed them on to customers queuing for bacon or buns. The butcher told the grocer it was an eyeball. The grocer relayed to the milliner that it had been a gold ring hidden in the jelly as some grotesque prank. The milliner, deciding this was insufficiently macabre, embroidered the story further until the ring became a wedding band with an inscription inside, clearly cut from a corpse. By tea time, it was established beyond reasonable doubt that the Institute's jam competition was the site of a murder confession, though whose murder and by whom remained inconveniently vague. Back at the hall, Purbright allowed the councillors to dismiss the gathering. The jars, apart from the suspicious one, were removed by their owners, with varying degrees of pride or humiliation. Mrs. Dewhurst left humming, Mrs. Clegg left trembling, and several others left thrilled at the prospect that they might soon be interviewed by the police. Nothing animated provincial respectability so much as the possibility of being questioned in connection with crime. When the hall had emptied to a mere scattering of chairs and crumbs, Purbright stood a while in the doorway, gazing at the high street beyond. It was a warm afternoon, and the air outside was thick with voices, eager and hungry. He knew the story would grow faster than he could chase it, and perhaps that was for the best. Gossip, in Flaxborough, was not a disease but a diagnostic tool. It revealed the town's anxieties and loyalties more faithfully than any formal statement. Sergeant Love approached, scratching his head. "Shall I take it along to the station, sir?" "The jar, I mean." "In due course," said Purbright mildly. He regarded the covered jar still resting on the table, untroubled by haste. "For the moment, Sergeant, I think we should let our neighbours continue their speculation. It is, after all, the one area of communal life in which they show true industriousness." Love grinned uncertainly. "Yes, sir. But what is it, do you think?" Purbright did not answer. Instead, he allowed himself the faintest smile, as though the question were not so much unanswered as not yet ripe for answering. He adjusted his hat, looked once more around the echoing hall, and then made his way out into the murmuring streets of Flaxborough, where the day's ordinary business had already taken on the flavour of scandal. Inspector Purbright did not hurry his inquiries. In Flaxborough, it was rarely productive to rush toward the obvious. The obvious, he had found, was usually only the loudest. Instead, he allowed the town to breathe out its excitement overnight and began his morning by strolling across the market square where the weekly stalls offered vegetables, fish, and second-hand indignations in equal measure. It was here, amidst the baskets of beans and the clang of a weighing scale, that he began the day's work. Not with stern questions, but with the sort of amiable greetings that coaxed loose threads from tongues otherwise tightly fastened. Mrs. Poole, clutching a brown paper bag of carrots, confided in a voice that pretended discretion, while ensuring two other shoppers could overhear, that she was quite certain the incriminating jar had belonged to Mrs. Clegg. "One can tell her handwriting anywhere," she declared, ignoring the fact that her knowledge of script extended little beyond grocery bills. Her neighbour, Mrs. Phipps, disagreed firmly. She had, she said, once received a thank-you card from Mrs. Dewhurst, and the label looked exactly like that, with a kind of stuck-up loop in the Y. She repeated this with relish, as though exposing an elegant crime. Purbright received both theories with equal politeness, offering nothing more than an interested nod. He knew well that each assertion, however biased, added another layer to the portrait he was slowly sketching, not of handwriting, but of loyalty and rivalry. By mid-morning, he and Sergeant Love made their way to the police station where the notorious jar had been conveyed, wrapped in brown paper by the reluctant councillors. It now sat on the sergeant's desk, looking simultaneously ordinary and obscene, like a teapot in a funeral parlour. Love hovered, clearly eager to treat it as evidence in some grim melodrama. "I've looked at it 3 times, sir," he confessed, "and every time it seems more like a bit of well flesh." Purbright regarded him mildly. "Flesh does not ordinarily find its way into preserves, Sergeant." "No, sir." Love shifted, abashed. "Though, if I may say so, it doesn't look like a fruit either. Then let us not for the moment insist upon what it is not." He had the jar placed in the evidence room, out of sight but not out of mind. What mattered more immediately was the town's theatre of reaction. He knew from a long habit that interviews conducted too soon, before gossip had had time to settle into shape, were often met with polite evasions. But when people believed their version of events had already achieved wide currency, they would defend it with fervour and detail, often to the point of contradiction. Thus, after luncheon, Purbright and Love walked to the neat, semi-detached house of Mrs. Clegg. They were admitted after a brief delay, during which the sound of rapid tidying, the clatter of crockery, and a muffled thump of cushions could be plainly heard. Mrs. Clegg emerged flushed, her hair tightly pinned, her face wearing the smile of one determined to appear both innocent and victimized. "Inspector," she said, breathless but gracious, "I do hope you've come to clear this dreadful business up. The things that are being said about me you would hardly credit." "I believe I would, Mrs. Clegg," Purbright said with courtesy. "If you would allow us a few minutes." They sat in her parlour, where the doilies seemed to have multiplied since the previous day. A plate of biscuits was produced, though untouched by their hostess, who launched into her protestations with an air of having rehearsed them. She insisted she had entered only her customary plum conserve, that she had labelled it herself, and that any suggestion otherwise was a malicious trick. "Malicious, Inspector," she repeated, tapping a plump finger on the arm of her chair, "and aimed squarely at me. There are those in the Institute who cannot abide that I have won 3 years running." Purbright listened, interjecting only with the occasional soft indeed or I see. At one point he asked gently, "And where is your jar now, Mrs. Clegg?" "Why, with the rest, I presume." "Unless, you don't suppose?" She broke off, eyes widening in melodramatic horror. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch before replying, "We shall know in due course. For the present, may I ask if anyone assisted you in preparing your entries?" "Assisted? Certainly not. I pride myself on independence. Mr. Clegg cannot even be trusted to spread jam properly on toast, let alone put it into jars." The inspector inclined his head, hiding a faint smile. Her defensiveness was too carefully aimed, too anxious to dismiss suspicion before it had been properly voiced. He thanked her with grave politeness, and she saw them out with a mixture of relief and indignation, already rehearsing how she would recount the interview to her neighbours. Their next visit was to Mrs. Dewhurst, who received them in her kitchen, where the scent of vinegar and spices hinted at further chutney experiments. Unlike Mrs. Clegg, she was serene, even cheerful, and offered tea at once. "I dare say you'll be wanting to know if I put something unspeakable in my jam," she said lightly. "I assure you, Inspector, my tastes run to apples and onions, not bones and whatever it was." "You had no difficulty recognizing the handwriting on the label?" Purbright asked, as though the matter were one of idle curiosity. "None at all," she replied quickly. "It was certainly not mine." Though between ourselves it did bear some resemblance to Mrs. Clegg's manner of writing. Love, who had been fidgeting with his notebook, glanced up with an eager nod. Purbright merely thanked her and changed the subject to the rising price of sugar. Yet he noted the speed of her reply, too sharp to be innocent. She had been waiting for that question, perhaps longing for it. As they walked back, Love muttered, "She's putting it on Mrs. Clegg straight away. Seems a bit too tidy, if you ask me." "Yes," said Purbright mildly. "Tidy explanations are often like tidy houses. They hide a good deal in the cupboards." That evening, as the town buzzed with fresh embellishments, Purbright sat in his office, gazing at the ceiling. The jar remained locked away, still unexplained, but the shape of the matter was becoming clearer, not in the object itself, but in the choreography of response around it. Mrs. Clegg, all bluster and fear. Mrs. Dewhurst, calm but eager to redirect suspicion, and between them a network of neighbours who would happily embroider any thread if it promised entertainment. What lingered most in his mind was the small label special reserve for judges only. Its phrasing was oddly deliberate, calculated to provoke curiosity. Too pointed for an accident, too artful for a mere prank. Somewhere in its careful wording, he suspected, lay the first step toward uncovering whose hand had guided this odd affair into being. He allowed himself a sigh, reached for his pipe, and reflected that in Flaxborough even jam could ferment into scandal potent enough to sour the whole town. Inspector Purbright's reflections on the suspicious jar were interrupted the following morning by a brisk knock at his office door. Sergeant Love entered with an expression of suppressed importance, carrying under his arm the local newspaper. He laid it on the inspector's desk with a kind of triumphant resignation, as though to say that matters had officially escaped the constabulary's monopoly. "Front page, sir," he announced. "They've given it a name already." The jam jar mystery. Purbright adjusted his spectacles and scanned the column. The editor, with the habitual caution of one conscious of libel, had refrained from naming names, but his reader's appetite for scandal had been amply fed by hints and insinuations. The article referred to a leading figure of the Institute, a rival of long standing, and a sinister object, believed by some to have been human in origin. The effect was to transform what had been a local curiosity into a melodrama in which every jam-maker was a potential poisoner and every conservatory a crime scene. "Human in origin, eh?" Purbright murmured. "That will delight the butcher's trade. Nothing like a whisper of cannibalism to shift an extra pound of sausages. Love, less amused, frowned. It'll stir them up, sir. Folk'll be pointing fingers proper now. That," said Purbright, folding the newspaper, "is precisely what I am counting on." By mid-morning he began the next round of inquiries. The councillors who had first discovered the jar were obvious starting points, though he anticipated more evasion than enlightenment. Councillor Harbottle received him in a sitting-room thick with the odour of mothballs and municipal dignity. He insisted, in tones of weary martyrdom, that he had seen very little. The jar, he said, had struck him as peculiar, but he had not lingered. His recollections of the label were hazy. What he chiefly remembered was Mrs. Clegg's swoon, which had obliged him to loosen her corset strings, a duty he recalled with the grim pride of a man who had suffered for public service. Councillor Dibb, by contrast, was expansive. Over a tumbler of something suspiciously amber, he confided that the jar was obviously foreign muck. He claimed to have once encountered a dish in Belgium which had looked much the same, though he could not name it beyond something with tripe. When pressed gently, he admitted he could not recall the handwriting on the label at all. "But I'd wager a guinea it was that Dewhurst woman," he declared. "She's got the look of mischief about her. Never trust a woman who smiles too much." The third councillor, Mr. Liversedge, proved the most nervous. He assured Purbright that he had hardly glanced at the contents, though he remembered clearly that the label had been very neat, like something done by a schoolmistress. He added, lowering his voice, that he hoped the police would handle it quietly, for the sake of the town's reputation. His anxiety about Flaxborough's good name seemed to exceed any interest in the object itself. Purbright left them with courteous thanks but little faith in their testimonies. Their accounts contradicted one another in detail while uniting in vagueness where it mattered most. Yet he found their reactions useful in their own way, Harbottle eager to recall his own gallantry, Dibb anxious to blame the foreign or the female, Liversedge terrified of scandal. Each revelation said more about the man than about the jar. By afternoon, the inspector turned to the Institute members beyond the two principal rivals. Mrs. Fenwick, renowned for her onions, received him in a kitchen fragrant with soil and polish. She admitted freely that she had not liked Mrs. Clegg's domination of the contest, but would never stoop to sabotage. "Besides," she remarked tartly, "if I wanted to get at her, I'd do it with onions." Much more certain to reduce her to tears. Another member, Miss Troughton, a spinster of delicate appearance but formidable gossiping stamina, claimed she had noticed a stranger loitering near the tables before the judging. A man inspector, tall with a coat too long for him. He looked at the jars most intently. She pursed her lips in satisfaction at producing a dramatic contribution. Purbright asked her to describe him further, but her details grew increasingly vague, until the figure seemed less a man than a convenient ghost conjured from the need to outdo her neighbours. Throughout these conversations, Sergeant Love scribbled notes with the zeal of one who believed each remark might conceal the key to the mystery. Yet, as they left Miss Troughton's cottage, he sighed. "It doesn't add up, sir. Every one of them has their own story, and not one matches." "That is the charm of Flaxborough," Sergeant Purbright observed mildly. "No one ever wishes to be left out of a good tale. Accuracy, I fear, is a casualty." That evening, while the sergeant was dispatched to check parish records of handwriting classes, an errand Purbright knew would yield little beyond the sergeant's greater respect for the stamina of elderly clerks, the inspector sat with the jar once more. He studied the label carefully, this time with a magnifying glass. The handwriting was neat, but not meticulous, the sort that suggested practice rather than natural elegance. There was a faint hesitation in the downward stroke of the J in Judges. It was not quite the confident loop of Mrs. Dewhurst's hand, nor the rounder letters of Mrs. Clegg. It was something in between, as though an imitator had been at work. He considered the possibility of forgery. It was plausible, perhaps even likely, that the label had been designed to resemble one of the rival contestants' styles closely enough to arouse suspicion. That, he reflected, was the essence of the matter, not the contents of the jar, but the spectacle of its discovery. Someone had wished to see Flaxborough divided, tongues wagging, reputations tottering. The object was secondary, the performance was the point. As the church clock struck 9, Purbright made a note in his diary, not what is in the jar, but who desired it to be seen. The audience is as important as the stage. He then closed the book, leaned back, and allowed himself the faintest of smiles. The town was playing its part with admirable enthusiasm, but sooner or later someone would overstep, and in their eagerness to accuse, reveal themselves. In Flaxborough, patience was always the surest detective. Inspector Purbright had no illusions that the case would yield to the kind of revelations beloved of penny thrillers. In Flaxborough, malice rarely marched openly. It preferred the stealth of embroidery threads and garden hedges, winding its way into the least expected corners. The jar, he reflected, was not so much evidence as provocation, an artifact introduced to stir the settled dust of village routine. Whoever had placed it there knew precisely the effect it would have, and Purbright suspected that the act of exposure mattered more than the object itself. Yet he needed to give the town's appetite for clarity something to chew upon, and so the following morning he called at the Institute's own modest headquarters, a red brick hall with a peeling signboard and an air of prim determination. The committee members had gathered ostensibly to discuss an upcoming charity raffle, but in reality to rehearse indignation over the slur cast upon their produce fair. They rose as Purbright entered, their faces a blend of moral outrage and guilty fascination. He thanked them with a small bow, and ignoring their flutter of greetings, asked in a tone as mild as milk whether anyone recalled having seen the contested jar before it was brought forward for judgment. His question dropped like a pebble into a pond. Mrs. Fenwick was the first to speak, declaring she had never so much as glimpsed it until Councillor Harbottle had turned pale beside the table. Miss Troughton insisted again that she had observed a stranger hovering near the display, and she described him once more with an enthusiasm that grew inversely proportional to the inspector's interest. Mrs. Dewhurst, cool and composed, stated firmly that she had seen no such man, and that the jar must have been placed surreptitiously at the last possible moment. Mrs. Clegg, meanwhile, seized the chance to proclaim that the whole business was an attempt upon her character, her enemies being legion and their envy boundless. Purbright allowed them to continue, his expression suggesting only polite curiosity, while in truth he observed the flickers in their manner, the way Mrs. Dewhurst's hands folded tightly in her lap, the twitch at the corner of Mrs. Clegg's mouth when her rival spoke, the eager sparkle in Miss Troughton's eye as she embroidered her account yet again. Each gesture was a thread, and he was content to let the tapestry grow more elaborate before tugging at its seams. Later that day, back at the station, Sergeant Love burst into the inspector's office holding a slip of paper. He had, with admirable if misdirected diligence, compared the handwriting on a jar's label to various samples retrieved from council records. "None of them match, sir," he reported with a mixture of disappointment and relief. "Not Mrs. Dewhurst's, not Mrs. Clegg's, nor any of the councillors. Though I did find that Councillor Dibb signs his name with a very curious flourish, like a fishhook." "Most appropriate," Purbright murmured. "He is, after all, a man fond of baiting." Love flushed, uncertain whether to treat it as humour or rebuke. "Then you think it was forged, sir?" "I think," Purbright replied, "that someone has been at pains to make us believe in forgery, which is not the same thing as the act itself." As the day waned, the inspector resolved to widen the circle of inquiry. Too much attention had been paid to the obvious combatants, Clegg and Dewhurst, while the subtler figures remained in the shadows. Flaxborough's dramas seldom revolved solely around their loudest performers. There were always quieter hands arranging the scenery. It was in this spirit that Purbright visited the vicarage. The Reverend Goff, a tall, abstracted man, welcomed him with absent-minded warmth. His wife, a bird-like creature of restless energy, insisted upon pouring tea while offering a stream of apologies for her scream during the unveiling of the jar. "I could not help it, Inspector. It was the very thought of something unnatural in jam, you see. Jam has always been a symbol of comfort to me ever since childhood." She fluttered, her words tumbling like loose hymn sheets until her husband coughed gently and reminded her of a choir practice. When she had withdrawn, Purbright asked, with his habitual softness, whether either of them had noticed unusual behaviour among the Institute ladies. The vicar considered, rubbing his chin. "There has been talk," he admitted, "of discontent. Mrs. Dewhurst has felt herself undervalued, I believe, and Mrs. Clegg, though much respected, can at times, well, one might say she oversins the psalms." "Enthusiasm is not always an unmixed blessing," Purbright observed. On his way back to the station he paused to speak with the librarian, Miss Teasdale, whose ears gathered more than any official ledger could hold. She leaned forward across her counter and whispered conspiratorially, "It was not a finger, Inspector. I have it on the best authority. It was a piece of candle wax, shaped, of course, in a way that suggested something worse, but candle wax none the less." Purbright lifted his brows. "Your authority being a cousin of Mrs. Harbottle's niece," she replied triumphantly. "And she had it from the councillor himself." The inspector inclined his head gravely, though he made no note. In Flaxborough, certainty was often the surest sign of error. Still, the suggestion of candle wax intrigued him. It fitted the suspicion that the jar had been engineered for effect, not substance. By nightfall he sat again in his office, the lamplight casting a mild glow upon his papers. He reviewed the day's interviews, piecing together the subtle alignments beneath the chatter. The contestants were locked in rivalry, yes, but rivalry alone rarely bred invention so sly. The councillors were anxious about the reputation of the townsfolk, hungry for scandal, and yet someone quiet, deliberate had taken the trouble to prepare a jar, to compose a label, to ensure its discovery. He leaned back, eyes half closed. A trivial object, yes, but introduced with dramatic timing. The jam jar was not a crime of passion, but of theatre. The question was not merely who had done it, but for whom the performance was staged. In that realization lay the key, though he allowed no sign of it to escape. He puffed at his pipe, let the smoke drift lazily toward the ceiling, and murmured to himself, "Flaxborough has always loved a stage. Now we must discover the playwright." The inspector's thought of a playwright lurking behind the business seemed to gain substance almost at once. By the next morning, the town's gossip had hardened into a sort of local folklore, the narrative having grown so fixed in the retelling that no facts could possibly dislodge it. To half of Flaxborough, Mrs. Clegg had been squarely framed. To the other half, Mrs. Dewhurst was the culprit beyond doubt. What united both camps was the conviction that the police would soon choose the correct villain, and that justice, in the form of public humiliation, would shortly follow. Purbright, strolling through the market square with his usual air of patient abstraction, was aware of conversations breaking off when he approached, only to resume with redoubled vigour once he had passed. Sergeant Love, whose ears were more credulous, brought back tales that grew more lurid with every errand. One version insisted that the jar had been found to contain blood, another that it was a relic of black magic, a third that it was proof of an affair between Mrs. Clegg and Councillor Dibb, though precisely the jar supported that conclusion no one was able to explain. Love delivered these accounts to Purbright with the earnestness of a messenger bearing state secrets, only to find his superior responding with mild, almost kindly indifference. "Do you never believe anything, sir?" the sergeant asked one afternoon, exasperated. "Oh, certainly," Purbright replied, tapping ash into the tray, "but only after it has been denied 3 times, loudly, by those most eager to avoid it." His inquiries now extended beyond the Institute. A visit to the grocer revealed that a certain quantity of paraffin wax had been sold the week before, not in itself remarkable, but made intriguing by the clerk's recollection that the purchaser had asked whether it could be shaved to resemble something less innocent. The buyer, however, had not been a housewife, but a young man with ink-stained fingers, thought to be connected with the local newspaper. Purbright stored this away carefully. If the object in the jar had indeed been wax, the trail might lead not to jealous rivals, but to those with an appetite for spectacle. Later that day, he called upon the newspaper office, a cramped building smelling of ink and damp paper. The editor, Mr. Tallentire, greeted him with exaggerated cordiality, his bald head gleaming under the single gas lamp. "Inspector, we've done our best to report responsibly, I assure you. The public, however, demands a little colour. It keeps circulation alive." "Colour is one thing," Purbright remarked mildly. "Inventing organs in jam is another." Tallentire laughed, a dry, paperish sound. "Ah, but no harm done, eh? Everyone enjoys a mystery, and it keeps people talking about the fair. I dare say attendance next year will be record-breaking." Purbright regarded him with that polite, unreadable expression which so often unsettled. Quiet. "But I wonder, Mr. Tallentire, whether your staff have been taking a more creative interest than the readership." The editor's smile faltered. He busied himself with papers. "Young fellows are keen to prove themselves, Inspector. They sometimes get carried away." "You mustn't suppose there's mischief intended." The inspector accepted the answer with a nod, though he did not believe it. He had noticed a faint smear of wax upon the corner of the desk, a detail he chose not to mention. That evening, Sergeant Love produced news of his own Miss Troughton. The tireless gossip had been overheard in the library boasting that she knew more than the police, and that she could identify the guilty party if only she were asked properly. Purbright, far from irritated, considered this development with satisfaction. People who claimed to know more than they did often revealed precisely what they had been told by the wrong person. He called upon her the next day. Miss Troughton received him with the delight of a child expecting to be given a prize. Her parlour was small and perfumed, crowded with porcelain figures that stared blindly from every shelf. She wasted no time in announcing that she had seen Councillor Dibb speaking with a shady character near the hall on the morning of the fair. Tall, with a coat too long, as I said before, she insisted, and I could swear there was something in his pocket, a jar-shaped bulge, Inspector. Purbright listened, his face as bland as bread pudding. "And you did not mention this before?" She flushed. "I was waiting for the right moment. Besides, one cannot be too careful. These matters can be dangerous." She leaned forward eagerly. "But you will see, won't you, that I was correct all along?" He thanked her, making no comment on the reliability of her recollection. But as he left, he considered the possibility that she had indeed seen someone carrying the jar. If so, then the councillors were not mere discoverers, but participants in the staging of the mystery. That night, back at the station, he summoned Sergeant Love. "We must consider," he said, "the possibility that the jar was introduced not by the contestants, but by those judging them. A diversion, perhaps? Or a joke gone too far?" Love frowned. "But why, sir? What would they gain?" Purbright smiled faintly. "What does Flaxborough always gain from such things, Sergeant?" "A new topic, a relief from monotony. And perhaps, though we shall see somebody hope to profit by more than conversation." For the first time since the affair began, he felt the investigation moving toward a sharper outline. The jar was theatre, yes, but not amateur theatricals. There was a hand behind the curtain, and it was a hand that belonged not to the bickering women of the Institute, but to men who feared dullness more than disgrace. As the church clock chimed 11, Purbright extinguished his lamp. Tomorrow he would call on the councillors again, this time not to hear their memories, but to watch their manner when the possibility of exposure was quietly, politely raised. Inspector Purbright began his morning with a deliberate slowness, drinking tea at his desk while Sergeant Love shifted restlessly in his chair opposite. The younger man plainly longed for action. He wanted statements, searches, perhaps even arrests of anything that resembled the decisive scenes from the detective novels he read on winter evenings. Purbright, however, seemed intent on staring at the rim of his cup, as though the pattern of leaves there contained greater truth than all the gossip of Flaxborough combined. At last he set the cup down and remarked, almost to himself, "Let us call upon our friends in municipal dignity again. A conversation with gentlemen who believe themselves innocent can be very revealing if one allows them the privilege of denial." Councillor Harbottle was first. He greeted them with a strained geniality that quickly faltered when Purbright, in his mildest tone, wondered aloud whether the mysterious jar had in fact been placed on the table by one of the judging committee. Harbottle blinked, turned the colour of weak beetroot, and declared in spluttering outrage that such an idea was monstrous. "We are men of standing, Inspector, men of probity." His vehemence was persuasive to nobody but himself. The inspector, bowing courteously, made no further challenge. He simply observed how Harbottle's hand trembled on the arm of his chair, and how his wife, bustling in with tea, glanced sharply at him as though to silence further indiscretion. Councillor Dibb was next. He met them in his snug where the curtains were drawn, though it was not yet midday. A decanter stood half empty on the sideboard. Dib laughed loudly when Purbright hinted at the possibility of the councillor's involvement. Preposterous. "Do you take us for schoolboys?" he roared, though his laughter had the brittle quality of glass under strain. When asked if he recalled speaking to anyone near the hall that morning, he swore he had spoken to no one save his fellow judges. Yet, in the pause after his denial, he reached for the decanter rather too quickly, as if liquid assurance might drown the memory of a conversation best forgotten. Councillor Liversedge, when approached, proved the most anxious of all. His protestations were polite but edged with panic, his eyes darting like those of a man pursued. He admitted he had seen a stranger near the building on the morning of the fair, but had thought nothing of it. Pressed gently, he grew flustered and contradicted himself within a sentence, finally begging that the inspector handle it discreetly for the town's sake. Purbright thanked him with grave civility, noting how the councillor's plea was less for his own honour than for the avoidance of scandal. When the two officers emerged once more into the street, Sergeant Love could scarcely contain his excitement. "They're rattled, sir." "You've hit something. One of them knows more than he'll say?" "Perhaps all three," Purbright replied softly. "But rattling cages only tells us the birds are inside. It does not tell us which has stolen the seed." The rest of the day passed in quiet errands. Purbright strolled the high street, paused at the post office, lingered by the drapers. Each stop gave him an opportunity to listen rather than speak, and what he heard confirmed his suspicion that the town had chosen its suspects, and they were not the councillors. The contest between Mrs. Clegg and Mrs. Dewhurst had grown into a kind of domestic civil war, each camp recruiting sympathisers who now regarded the other with an enmity out of all proportion to the facts. It was exactly the distraction a guilty hand behind the scenes would have wanted. That evening, however, the story took a sharper turn. A constable arrived breathless at the station, carrying news that a second jar had been discovered, this one not at the hall, but placed carefully on the step of the institute itself. The label read, "Another offering to be judged." Inside was not wax nor anything sinister, but simply a murky mixture of sugar water and shredded newspaper. Its contents were ridiculous, but its appearance at such a pointed location suggested deliberate escalation. Purbright went at once to examine it. The jar was common enough, the handwriting similar to the first label, but with a slightly altered slant, as though the writer, in mimicking their earlier effort, had overthought the disguise. The inspector studied it a long while, saying nothing, until Sergeant Love burst out, "Well, sir, that settles it. Someone's taunting us now. First the fair, now the institute itself. Who'd do such a thing? Someone who wishes the town to talk, Sergeant, and someone who knows they are succeeding." He had the jar brought to the station, though he treated it with no more solemnity than he would a parcel of boiled sweets. What interested him most was not the jar itself, but the timing. It had appeared after his conversations with the councillors, as though in answer to his quiet probing. It was as if the unseen hand, sensing attention drawing near, had chosen to distract once more with theatrics. That night, Purbright sat alone in his office, the lamplight soft on the polished wood, the faint sound of the river drifting through the open window. He considered the jars, the rivalries, the councillors' unease. Bit by bit a pattern began to form, though he kept it close, turning it over like a coin in his mind. Whoever was behind the performance was not reckless but calculated, intent on prolonging the drama until the town itself supplied the condemnation. The culprit would not need to strike openly. Flaxborough would do the work for them, so long as the stage props were provided. He closed his notebook with quiet finality and murmured, "It is the stage we must watch now, not the actors," for he knew that the next appearance of a jar would not be random, It would be placed where the audience was largest and the reaction most rewarding. And with that realization, he began to prepare for the play's next act. Inspector Purbright was correct in his prediction that the next act of the play would not take long to arrive. On the following morning, a stir ran through Flaxborough with the speed of a dropped match in dry grass. A third jar had been discovered, this time not in a hall or on a doorstep, but in the window of the town's most prominent shop, Plover's Drapery and Haberdashery, where it had been placed neatly between a pair of artificial carnations and a stack of lace doilies. The window dresser swore she had left the display immaculate the evening before, only to find the jar waiting at dawn, as though it had grown there overnight. The placement was deliberate and theatrical. All who passed along the high street that morning stopped to stare, their reflections merging with the odd contents of the jar, this one filled with syrup, in which floated what appeared to be scraps of velvet ribbon. The label reads in the same hand as before, "Final exhibit for all to see." When Sergeant Love brought Purbright the news, his face bore a mixture of alarm and excitement. "They're making fools of us, sir, right under everyone's nose. The whole town's gawping at it." "Of course they are," Purbright replied, reaching for his hat with his customary, unhurried grace. "That is the purpose. We must consider not merely the jar, but the theatre in which it is displayed." At the shop, a small crowd had already gathered, whispering and pointing with the eager solemnity of parishioners inspecting a new tombstone. Mr. Plover himself, a dapper man whose moustache was cultivated with more care than his accounts, wrung his hands in indignation. "Disgraceful, Inspector! My establishment turned into a peep show. I insist on its removal." Purbright examined the jar through the glass before having it carried into the back room. He studied the label closely, noting again the slight tremor in the strokes, as though the writer were imitating a style not wholly their own. The contents of the syrup and ribbon confirmed his suspicion that the jars were not meant to deceive, but to provoke. Their absurdity was calculated, their placement strategic. "Do you observe, Sergeant," he said quietly, "how each appearance increases the audience? First the Institute fair, then the Institute doorstep, now the High Street itself. The stage expands, and with it the applause." Love frowned. "So it's all for show, but who'd go to such trouble? And why? That is precisely what we must discover. Whoever our playwright is, he thrives on attention. It is not the jars that matter, Sergeant, but the conversations they breed." Throughout that day, Purbright allowed himself to drift among those conversations. At the post office, the jar was said to contain a strangled kitten. At the butcher's, a woman swore she had heard it was a blood-soaked rag. At the chemist's, it was confidently asserted that the inspector himself had planted it to increase police funding. Each story grew as soon as it left one mouth and entered another. The town was intoxicated with rumour, each citizen delighted to carry a drop more of scandal in their jug. That evening, Purbright returned to the station with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Sergeant Love, however, was frustrated. "We're no nearer to finding the fellow, sir. 3 jars and not a trace of who left them. It could be anyone." "Not anyone," Sergeant Purbright said softly. "Only someone who understands Flaxborough well enough to exploit its appetite, and someone who has the means to set the scene without arousing suspicion. Think who moves freely in and out of halls, doorsteps, and shop windows without comment." Love stared, puzzled. "Shopkeepers? Delivery men?" "Or," Purbright murmured, "journalists." The suggestion hung in the air like pipe smoke. Love recalled the editor's nervousness, the faint smear of wax on his desk, the ink-stained fingers of the young reporter. "You think it's the paper, sir?" "But why would they?" "Circulation, Sergeant. A small town thrives on its scandals, and a newspaper thrives on a town's appetite for scandal." To test this thought, Purbright paid another visit to the newspaper office late in the evening when the building was dim and quiet. The editor, Mr. Tallentire, welcomed him with forced affability, offering a seat and pouring tea that smelled faintly of ink. Purbright remarked casually on the appearance of the third jar, watching closely for reaction. Tallentire's smile flickered but recovered quickly. "Ghastly business," he said, "but you must admit, Inspector, it has people talking. No one's spoken so animatedly about jam in years." "Indeed," Purbright replied, his voice gentle, "and no doubt your sales reflect that." The editor laughed, but his eyes darted to a stack of freshly printed sheets as though to conceal them. Purbright asked after his staff. Tallentire mentioned them by name, lingering for just a fraction too long on the young reporter, Ray, whose enthusiasm had, he admitted, occasionally run ahead of his judgment. When Purbright left, he did not yet have proof, but he had something more useful, the faint scent of guilt, masked by bravado. He knew better than to act upon it immediately. Instead, he resolved to let the play run a little longer, confident that an author eager for applause could never resist an encore. As he walked home through the lamplit streets, the inspector considered the jars not as clues but as cues in a performance. They had begun with shock, moved to escalation, and now reached the height of spectacle. What came next, he felt sure, would be the scene where the playwright overstepped, allowing the mask to slip. And when that moment arrived, he would be ready to take his bow. The morning after the appearance of the draper's window jar, Flaxborough awoke with the pleasurable unease of a town convinced it was living through history. Housewives adjusted their shopping lists in order to pass the scene of discovery. Children, dispatched on errands, lingered to peer at the spot where the offending object had been removed, their imaginations furnishing horrors more vivid than any ribbon floating in syrup. Even the rector was obliged to mention, in his Sunday sermon, the perils of allowing gossip to ferment unchecked. Few heard his cautionary note, most listened only in the hope of gleaning a new clue from the pulpit. Inspector Purbright, however, remained serenely unhurried. He began his day as usual with quiet perambulation about the square, acknowledging greetings and responding with genial half-smiles. His very calmness served as a counterpoint to the town's fever. People mistook his composure for ignorance, in truth. It was patience. He knew the unseen hand would not resist a fourth appearance, and he meant to be watching when it occurred. Sergeant Love, less philosophical, pressed for action. "We ought to search that newspaper office, sir, or at least question that young fellow Ray. He's the sort who'd think himself clever pulling stunts like this." "Perhaps," Purbright conceded, "but a man who seeks applause must be allowed to perform to the end of his act. Interrupt him too soon and one never learns the nature of his play." That afternoon, Love reported breathlessly that a new rumour had begun that a jar was expected to appear at the evening's council meeting. The suggestion had spread so widely that townsfolk intended to attend not for civic duty but for spectacle. Purbright considered this with mild amusement. "Our playwright has cultivated his audience so well," he murmured, "that the crowd itself now anticipates the next scene. That, Sergeant, is both a triumph and a trap." The council chamber was unusually full that night. Alongside the councillors sat townspeople who had not attended such meetings in years, their faces bright with expectation. They watched every movement of the clerk, as though jars might spring from beneath their pens. The atmosphere was half theatre, half courtroom. Councillor Harbottle cleared his throat repeatedly, as though rehearsing denials in advance. Councillor Dibb shifted uncomfortably, his hand straying too often to his flask. Councillor Liversedge looked pale enough to faint. Purbright took a discreet seat near the back, his eyes moving not to the councillor's table, but to the young reporter Ray, who was scribbling furiously in his notebook. The lad's expression betrayed both excitement and nerves, like an actor hoping for his cue. Purbright noted how Ray's inky fingers smudged the page, leaving dark streaks that resembled the tremor in the handwriting on the labels. The meeting began in dull formality accounts, drainage, petitions about paving stones, but the audience's restlessness grew. Whispers hissed through the chamber, people glanced under benches, some even craned their necks toward the windowsills. The expected jar, however, failed to materialize. Disappointment hung heavy. It was at this moment that Purbright's patience was rewarded. He saw Ray shift in his seat, reach under his chair, and then hesitate, his hand resting on a shape that bulged from his satchel. The inspector leaned forward, rising without haste, and approached the lad with the quiet inevitability of a man requesting the time. Ray startled, his hand jerking away, but not quickly enough. Purbright's gaze fell on the rim of glass peeking from the bag. He placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Might I relieve you of that parcel?" he asked, in a tone as courteous as if requesting a teacup. A collective gasp rose from the assembly. Ray flushed crimson, stammered, and fumbled for words, but Purbright deftly drew forth the satchel's contents to another jar, this one containing little more than water and a few shriveled rose petals. Its label read, "The verdict approaches." The room erupted into chatter, scandalized and thrilled. Councillors shouted for order, citizens leaned forward eagerly, and the young reporter buried his face in his hands. Purbright raised the jar calmly for all to see, then set it on the councillor's table with the air of a man concluding a parlour game. When at last he spoke, his voice was mild and steady. "I think we may agree that the matter has reached its natural climax." He gestured toward Ray, who sat slumped in humiliation. "Here, gentlemen, is our playwright, too fond of sensation, too eager for applause. Wax, syrup, ribbons, scraps of paper, each stage prop, more absurd than the last, and each designed not to deceive, but to inflame conversation." The chamber buzzed with disbelief and satisfaction in equal measure. Some were scandalized that such a trick should come from the press, others delighted that the mystery was solved without any true horror at its core. Mrs. Clegg and Mrs. Dewhurst, both in attendance, looked equally betrayed, though Mrs. Dewhurst's relief flickered through her indignation. Purbright concluded with quiet firmness, "This town has been the victim of a hoax, not a crime. But hoaxes, Sergeant," he turned to love can wound reputations as surely as knives. "Let us remember that, and treat our neighbours' tales with the caution they deserve." As the meeting dissolved into noisy debate, Purbright guided the chastened reporter outside. He did not lecture him, he merely walked beside him in silence until they reached the darkened street. At last he said, "Fame built on falsehood, Mr. Ray, is a brittle thing. It crumbles at the first touch of truth. Remember that, if you wish a career longer than the life of a jam jar." With that he left the boy to his mortification and turned back toward the station, his stride steady, his thoughts already moving to the paperwork that inevitably followed. He knew the town would feast on the revelation for weeks, but for him the play was over, the curtain had fallen. All that remained was to tidy the stage. The evening of the council meeting left Flaxborough in a state of exhilaration, but the mood the following day was more complicated. Excitement at the unmasking of the culprit had mingled with an awkward sense of betrayal, for the townsfolk had enjoyed their scandal so much that the revelation of its ridiculous manufacture robbed them of something precious. It was as if a favourite stage play had ended in a farce rather than a tragedy, leaving them with no grand villain, but only a sheepish young reporter whose ambition had exceeded his judgment. Inspector Purbright, walking the high street that morning, felt the undercurrent of dissatisfaction. Shopkeepers greeted him politely, but without their usual relish for passing on news. Their tails had been punctured, and in their hearts they resented the man who had done the puncturing. Only Miss Troughton, undaunted by fact, continued to assert that there had been a stranger in a long coat, and that the boy from the newspaper was but a decoy for darker forces. She enjoyed her role so much that she clung to it with an almost religious fervour. At the station, Sergeant Love remained uneasy. "It seems too simple, sir," he said, as he tidied a stack of reports. "All this fuss for scraps of wax and ribbon? I can't help thinking we've missed something. Why would a lad like Ray risk his position just to see his stories on the front page?" Purbright regarded him over the rim of his spectacles. "Sensation has a way of intoxicating the young sergeant. What seems trifling to us appears to them as the means of glory. Still, you are right to be uneasy. Simplicity should never be trusted until it has endured a little testing." That afternoon, a quiet visit from Mr. Tallentire, the newspaper's editor, offered a new perspective. The man entered with an air of contrition, bowing almost theatrically as he laid his hat on the inspector's desk. "You will understand, Inspector, that the Gazette regrets profoundly the mischief wrought by young Ray. He has been suspended, of course. We cannot have the dignity of the press compromised." Purbright inclined his head politely, but said nothing. Tallentire, misreading the silence, pressed on. The boy acted alone, of that I am certain, a foolish enthusiasm no doubt encouraged by the atmosphere of rivalry in the town. "Still, I would be obliged if you would confirm as much for the record. We would not wish unnecessary suspicion to linger about our institution." The inspector's smile was thin. "The record, Mr. Tallentire, is a curious thing. It has a habit of preserving not what we wish, but what has occurred. For the moment, I am content to let the boy's part speak for itself. As for the rest, time is a remarkable clarifier." Tallentire shifted in his chair, his fingers fidgeting with the brim of his hat. Purbright noted the sheen of perspiration on his brow, and the way his eyes flickered towards the sealed cupboard where the jars were stored. It was a glance too swift, too instinctive to be explained by mere curiosity. When the editor left, the inspector leaned back, tapping his pipe thoughtfully against the ashtray. "Love, watching?" asked quietly. "Do you believe him, sir?" "Belief, Sergeant," Purbright replied, "is a luxury. Observation will serve us better." The following evening brought a curious incident. A small crowd gathered outside the Gazette office, pointing to its notice board, where a fresh poster had been pasted, "The Jam Mystery Full Confession Tomorrow." The townsfolk, starved of drama for barely a day, thrilled at the promise. But Purbright, reading the bold letters in the dusk, felt a different chill. Ray was under suspension and unlikely to be producing confessions of any kind. The hand behind this notice, then, could only be the editor's, or another who wished to draw the curtain for one final act. The inspector attended the Gazette the next morning, but no confession appeared in print. Instead, the paper carried a bland editorial on the need for civic harmony. Tallentire explained, with oily sorrow, that the boy had lost his nerve and withdrawn his statement. Purbright thanked him with his customary politeness, but inside he felt the weight of certainty deepen. The lad might have been reckless, but the orchestration, the careful staging, belonged to an older, more calculating mind. That certainty grew later that day when Mrs. Dewhurst called at the station. She arrived ostensibly to clear her name, but in the course of her protestations she let slip a curious remark that Councillor Harbottle had once boasted of ensuring the Gazette never wanted for drama. It had been said jokingly, she claimed, yet she had thought it odd that the Purbright stored this quietly, the threads now weaving into a pattern that showed the councillors and the editor in a far more tangled alliance than mere happenstance. By evening, he knew the farce had not yet ended. The jars had been tools, the boy a pawn, the town an audience. Somewhere behind them all still stood the playwright, eager for one last bow. Purbright gazed from his office window at the quiet street beyond, the lamplight settling over Flaxborough like a curtain falling. He felt the stillness of anticipation in the air, as though the stagehands had set everything in place and were waiting for the final cue. He tamped his pipe, lit it with care, and murmured to himself, "Tomorrow, I think, the play concludes." Inspector Purbright allowed the morning to pass in his usual fashion, never betraying urgency, though he knew with quiet certainty that the play had only one scene left to run. He let Sergeant Love attend to the town's minor complaints, a dispute over hens trespassing into a neighbour's garden, a report of bicycle theft, later discovered to be a nephew borrowing without leave, while he himself moved deliberately from one small conversation to another. A word with the librarian, a nod to the vicar's wife, a few courteous observations to the grocer, all part of the inspector's slow weaving of context until the threads could be drawn into their final pattern. By afternoon he had gathered the essential characters in the council chamber, ostensibly to clarify the matter of the jars once and for all. Councillors Harbottle, Dibb, and Liversedge sat stiffly at one end of the long table. Mrs. Clegg and Mrs. Dewhurst, equally bristling, occupied chairs opposite. Mr. Tallentire, the Gazette's editor, came reluctantly, smoothing his cuffs with the air of a man dragged from more dignified pursuits. Young Ray, pale and chastened, was also present, though his expression suggested he would have preferred exile. Sergeant Love, notebook poised, glanced anxiously at his superior. Purbright began in the same mild voice with which he might have opened a parish raffle. "We are gathered, ladies and gentlemen, because this town has suffered a trifling but troublesome mischief. Several jars, each bearing peculiar labels, have been displayed in such a way as to provoke speculation, suspicion, and, if I may say so, some regrettable ill-feeling. Our duty now is not merely to identify the hand that placed them, but to understand why." The councillors shifted. Mrs. Clegg sniffed with indignation. Mrs. Dewhurst folded her hands with an air of self-control. Tallentire looked away, his lips pressed tight. Purbright continued, his gaze resting on none of them for long. "The jars themselves told us little. Wax, ribbons, rose petals, absurd contents, chosen not for their substance but their suggestion. What mattered was the audience, not the exhibit. Each jar was placed where the most eyes could see, first the fair, then the institute, then the high street. A hoax, yes, but a hoax conducted with theatrical awareness. It was a performance." He paused, allowing the silence to settle. The handwriting on the labels was imitative. It sought to resemble Mrs. Clegg's, or perhaps Mrs. Dewhurst's, but never convincingly enough to withstand scrutiny. It was the sort of handwriting produced by someone who had handled much print and ink, but little domestic correspondence. Someone from the Gazette, perhaps. All eyes turned to young Ray, who flushed scarlet. He opened his mouth to protest, but Purbright lifted a hand. The boy indeed carried the last jar, intending to unveil it at the council meeting. But he did not conceive the idea, nor did he prepare the first jars. His role was that of an apprentice actor, given props and encouraged to seek applause. The true author of our little drama stood behind him, feeding the town's appetite for sensation. His gaze now settled gently on Mr. Tallentire. The editor stiffened, colour rising to his temples. "Inspector, this is absurd. You cannot suppose, I suppose, only what observation compels," Purbright said softly. "It was you, Mr. Tallentire, who stood to benefit most. Each new jar inflated rumour, and each rumour inflated sales. Your paper thrived on the scandal, and you ensured it would not falter by providing fresh material. The councillors, anxious for the town's reputation, whispered their fears to you. The Institute ladies, eager to guard or wound one another's pride, supplied further fuel. All you required was a pliant hand to place the jars where they would cause the greatest stir. Young Ray, eager for advancement, served your purpose. The room grew still. Harbottle cleared his throat, Dib muttered, and Mrs. Clegg looked almost disappointed to be denied the crown of victimhood. Talentire opened his mouth, closed it, then attempted a laugh that fooled no one. "Really, Inspector, you credit me with excessive cunning." "Not excessive," Purbright replied. "Merely sufficient. But cunning, like jam, is best kept in moderation. Too much, and it cloys." There was no triumphant outburst, no melodramatic confession. Talentire merely sagged into his chair, his silence an admission more eloquent than denial. Ray, to his credit, looked wretched rather than defiant. Purbright, satisfied, brought the meeting to a close with his customary courtesy, suggesting that perhaps the town might now return to the less hazardous competitions of marrows and sponge cakes. In the days that followed, Flaxborough resumed its routines, though with a faint unease that lingered like a shadow after sunset. The Gazette printed a solemn apology, couched in terms that sought to preserve dignity while confessing little. Ray departed for a distant apprenticeship, his ambition dented but not destroyed. Talentire retained his position, though the town regarded him with new wariness, as one might regard a conjurer who had once made mischief with more than rabbits. As for Mrs. Clegg and Mrs. Dewhurst, their rivalry continued, though the sharpest edge had dulled. They returned to their jam jars with redoubled vigour, each more determined than ever to win the next fair, by honest means, or at least means less likely to involve scandal in the High Street. Inspector Purbright returned to his paperwork, his pipe smoke curling gently through the quiet of the station office. When Sergeant Love, still restless, asked whether he regretted that no real crime had been uncovered, Purbright smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Sergeant. Human folly is quite enough to occupy us. And in Flaxborough it seldom runs short." He bent once more over his files, the murmur of the town beyond the window already softening back into its ordinary rhythms, as though the jars had been no more than an interlude.